driving at peak speeds. Thank God. Yeah. Yeah, we have that. Not likely, but 45 minutes is much longer than the other. Yeah. But I think for a pitch, makes himself work to do that. Presumably it's quite a mixed culture in terms of shopping and expectation. Talk 3 hours. That's what I paid for. That's what I want.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming to the Geological Society here this afternoon. Before we get started, I've been informed that there are no scheduled fire alarms. So should the alarm should the alarm sound, it is advisable that we all try and leave as quickly and as safely as is possible. So we will try not to interrupt you, of course, Craig. There are fire exits out the front here and also out the back. The second thing is, if any of you have one of these things, i.e. a mobile phone, if it could be in the off or the silent position, thank you very much. I'll pay you later for that. Or if you would like to take a call, if your phone does ring and you want to take it, then please put it on speakerphone so we can all hear what it is you're speaking about. Okay? So my name is Dr. Sarah Gordon. I am a council member here at the Geological Society of London, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you here today to the second of our London lectures in 2017. Now, in the Geological Society, every year has a theme, and for a multitude of different reasons, 2017 is our year of risk, okay? So there are lots of different reasons for this. And so that's what leads us into this lecture that we're going to listen to today, which is entitled, Rain, Rain, Go Away, Are We Ready for Our Future Flood Risk? See what you did there with that title?
Not quite well enough, though.
Okay, I'll let you correct me as we go through the lecture. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. Craig Wallhouse of the Environment Agency. Now, from our long coastline to our flashy western and northern rivers, to the poorest vales of the south and east with their broad floodplains and groundwater, the UK has been prone to flooding forever. However, residential and industrial development in floodplains and coastal lowlands has converted this threat into one of the top 5 major risks facing our country. Over 5 million homes and businesses in England are at risk of flooding. And despite increased investment in flood defences and increasingly effective incident management, the flood risk is still increasing. Why? Partly because our weather is changing. So to take us on this journey of what we've learnt from both the summer and the winter floods of this century so far, we welcome Craig Wallhouse. Craig is a senior manager in the Environment Agency, the government's main advisors and the operating authority for flood risk in England. Over the past 8 years, Craig has led the development of the agency's flood forecasting, warning, and incident response arrangements. And he's also gained personal operational experience through working on flooding in Yorkshire, the Thames Valley, Somerset, and the east coast of England. So don't follow Craig, because there might be a flood somewhere close to you. Is that what we're learning? Okay. Craig is now a member of the Institution of Civil Engineers expert panel on water issues. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to welcome Craig Wallhouse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everyone, for turning out this afternoon. What have we got, then? I had rain, rain, go away. It's bound to come another day, and that's really the message of flood risk for the future. It is going to happen. It'll probably be in a location that hasn't had it badly before. It'll be probably worse than you think, and a fair number of things will happen that we really hadn't thought about. Now, learning from the past is important, so what I want to do is just show how good we are at learning from things that happen to us in floods and doing something about them so the risk in the future is better managed. And at the moment, the slides aren't moving on. I switched it on now. Excellent. Okay, let's start. Now, what I want to do is give you a journey back to 1953. And I know with such a young audience, no one will remember 1953. One or two, thank you. I want to say a little bit about the scale of the risk, some of the numbers and evidence around the risk, and then say something about how we've learnt from recent flood events and implemented improvements to the way we build flood defences, the way we operate flood defences, our forecasting and warning and incident response, but also raise the question about what are all you doing about your flood risk? Because most of you at some stage in the next few years will either have your home flooded, have your travel disrupted, or know of a family member who has suffered from flooding, because it is a significant impact on our lives now. There's barely a winter goes by without us having a big story in the news. So I also want to bring out what we can do as individuals, as well as what government can do around flood risk, and ensure that we are getting ready for the future. Now, the East Coast surge of 1953 probably sticks in the mind of those who manage flood risk because of the loss of life. 307 people died on the night of January the 31st over on to the 1st of February 1953. There was a coastal surge caused by a low-pressure system going down the North Sea, tracking down the east coast of England. Although there'd been loss of life already through sinking of shipping, a lot of Scotland's trees in the north of Scotland got knocked down, there was no warning or thinking for the communities down the east coast on the flood risk that may arise that night. People were still going out on dinner dances on Southend Pier as people were dying 50 miles up the coast. Quite remarkable from today's context that such a thing could happen, but it did. And the picture in the middle with the hotel on, that may look like snow, but it's actually sand. During 1953, the onshore winds whipped up 7-8 metre high waves, which were the main cause of damage to flood defences, and blew a load of sand inland. So there were all sorts of impacts, but in communities such as Canby Island, where 50 people died, defences were overtopped, evacuation wasn't possible in the time available, and as a result, the nation suffered its biggest loss of life since the Second World War. Picture on the bottom left is overtopping of defences on the River Thames into London. If that hadn't happened to sort of take away some of the floodwater, central London would have flooded. So it's only the fact that the defences failed that London in the centre was saved. Not a way of managing flood risk, I would suggest, but that's what nature does. And that's just an image of some of the defences in Lincolnshire that got damaged. In effect, they got ripped apart by the wave action. And that was principally because we didn't know how to design flood defences to withstand the power of the sea at the time. The engineers got it wrong. After any disaster, there's a government review. Viscount Waverley took charge of that review. When you read the list of people who were on the committee reviewing, it did read like something like the House of Lords in terms of the people used. But at the time, within the UK, we had some really excellent researchers developing an understanding of coastal processes. And I think without that expert research capability, the review would have missed a few key points. But before we go on to the learning from the 53 review by Viscount Waverley, had we had the chance to learn before then? Had there been some signals that people on the East Coast were at risk? And of course, there had been. There'd been a Royal Commission in 1911 to look at coastal defences, how we built them, where they were. And the review said, we've got to do some research. We've got to invest in understanding the risk and developing an approach for the future. Royal Commission report ditched. Great War came along, all forgotten. 1932, the Essex River Board, and the Essex area suffered really badly in the 1953 flood. Effectively, they said we've abandoned our coastal defences. We haven't invested enough, we haven't maintained them. They're basically not up to scratch. 1932. 1949, there was a daytime surge which caused a few breaches in the East Coast, overtopped a few locations. Everyone went, got away with that, didn't we? No reaction. 1953, 307 people died. Again, Viscount Waverley pulled out, research and evidence is needed. There's no point building flood defences if they fall apart under wave action. Also, we need to invest in them in an appropriate way. And it's interesting to compare the English and the Dutch approach to investment after 1953, when 1,800 people died in Holland at the same time. 2/3 of the country in Holland is at risk of flooding. Rather less in England, 7-8%. The Dutch approach was to say, this just cannot happen. So they went for, we'll set a standard of flood defence and build everything to that standard. Within England, the view was, there's less at risk, we've got an awfully long coastline to defend compared to Holland, we'll invest where it makes economic sense to invest. And basically, those two investment principles are still in play today in England and Holland. Viscount Waverley said, you can't let London flood. We really need to do something to protect London from coastal risk. And within 30 years, we'd built the Thames Barrier. So it didn't take long to turn around that action. Coastal forecasting and warning, all those people who died, Viscount Waverley said, if we'd have just given them an early heads up, most of those lives would have been saved. You didn't need coastal defences to evacuate people. You just needed the right information early enough. So he set up, in effect, the coastal warning system we now use and operate today. He started it off. It was from September to April, only half the year, because that's when the worst storms are coming through. And interestingly, they considered whether or not the BBC should carry warnings of flooding down the East Coast. And they decided, no, we shouldn't issue warnings through the BBC because it would alarm people somewhat, so we better not do it. So, you know, a different culture, a different time. Now, the test is, did we learn from 1953? Did we do those positive things like the Thames Barrier? We did tick. Did we set up a coastal and warning system? We did tick. Have we considered and really managed development along the coast? Well, sort of possibly. So what's the situation today? And I don't know, December 2013, were you aware there was a big coastal surge in December 2013? Because it disappeared off the news very quickly, because Nelson Mandela died the same night it happened, and that became the news story rather than the coastal surge. But that coastal surge had higher levels than 1953 from Immingham northwards and around Kent. Similar levels around Norfolk and Essex. Nobody died. A tenth of the property flooded, a tenth of the land flooded. There was some infrastructure damage, but life went on. It got going. I remember going around London that evening as the surge passed through. It was a normal day in London. Life in London continued, yet the Thames Barrier had defended the city against the highest tide since it had been built. And I guess for most people, that's how flood defences should work. You know, let's get on with life. But of course, what if it had been a bit bigger and had started coming over the top of defences? Would Londoners have been ready to do the right thing? Would they have known what the right thing to do was? So in summary, I think 53, although it took some time to get the barrier built, at least 1953's review set in train getting a barrier built, putting defences in good order by doing the right research, and we had very few breaches in 2013 compared to 1953. And we had a warning system which gave people information days in advance. We were forecasting the surge 7 days in advance. Not in terms of the detail, but in knowing that there was a significant surge likely to happen on the Thursday to Friday. And of course, London is protected not just by the Thames Barrier, but 350 kilometres of hard defences, concrete defences, up and down the estuary and into central London, and a whole range of other barriers to protect inland areas on creeks, etc. So it is a big system to be managed, but it allows London to continue to operate safely as an economic hub for the country. Without those coastal defences, London would not operate. Because twice a day, the walls in London protect many parts of London from flooding. Just a normal tide would flood parts of London. So 53, a good lesson to us. Learn the lessons of nature throwing at you. Do something about it. And our flood risk challenge for the future is not only to learn lessons, but I think try and get ahead of lessons. And you know, a lot of people say, why do you have to keep learning lessons? But sometimes you need to have something significant to prompt the right investment and action. And that's about us, as well as governments, wanting that action. But within the UK, we've got river flooding, and do you know the Abbey, bottom right hand? Tewkesbury, excellent. City, bottom left. You see, you're all from the south, aren't you? It's Carlisle, excellent. And you won't get the top left because it's an obscure place in Australia, but it's a really good image of surface water flooding. What can happen to places when the heavens just open? That's not a river, that's a main road. Now, 1 in 6 properties in England are at risk of flooding. So that's about 5 million homes and businesses. 2.7 from rivers and the coast, just over 3 million from surface water. just deluge of rainfall on the ground and the drains not taking it away. Groundwater flooding, probably around 125 to 250,000 properties at risk from groundwater flooding, mainly in the southeast and along the chalk areas of the south. Out of those, 600,000 are at high risk, frequent risk of flooding, still, despite all the investment in flood risk management. So there are a large number of people who live in properties where, over their lifetime in that property, they can probably expect to be flooded once or twice. And we'll come on to what your home being flooded means to you, because it is one of the events in your life, if you suffer it, which is right at the top in terms of the likelihood of causing depression, stress, and a dislocation of your whole life. It shouldn't be underestimated, which is why we see the pictures of people on the news, TV, who've been flooded, who after the initial shock want to find someone to blame, because their lives have been turned upside down. What sort of floods do we have to manage within England? Well, we've got those summer thunderstorms, that convective rainfall. And for any sort of rainfall duration under 3 hours, all of the rainfall records for England are in the summer months. So it's that intense downpour which is our worry. And the 2007 floods I'll mention shortly are an example of that. But we've also got that continuous flow of frontal rainfall coming in from the Atlantic. And the longer term, 1 day, 2 day, 3 day rainfall totals are all in the winter and all in Cumbria. So if you like rain, Cumbria in the winter is the place to go. And interestingly, that frontal rainfall, all of the records are in the last 5 years. For summer rainfall, all of the records predate 1975. And climate change is telling us hotter, drier summers, milder, wetter winters. Although in summer, maybe that rain concentrating more. But we haven't seen any extreme record rainfall for summer thunderstorms since 75. But we'll come back to 2007 in a minute. Storm surges I've mentioned earlier, and for the East Coast, which is probably the area we worry about most in terms of storm surge, it's low pressure systems hooking around the north of Scotland and then tracking down the East Coast. That low pressure system allows the water to rise, high winds causing a surge. If it coincides with high tide, Bob's your uncle, we're in a bit of trouble. If that surge coincides with low tide, we can breathe a sigh of relief. And it is that difference that makes, in forecasting terms, the challenge, getting that timing right and understanding right. Of course, the storms from the west also bring in that frontal rainfall. And 2009, 2005, 2015 have seen some really severe storms, all heading towards the northwest. But 2013-14, those moved further south, and we saw them across Cornwall, Devon, Dorset, and into the Thames Valley. And there are indices that meteorologists look at, such as the North Atlantic Oscillation Index, which gives some indication of potential risk. So a high index on the NAO, the North Atlantic Oscillation, tends to link to high rainfall. And we saw that in 13-14 and 15-16. But it doesn't always work. 2010 had an even higher index, but we didn't have any floods. So they are useful forward indicators, but they're not useful forecasting of specific events. So all of those are what we've got to worry about as the Environment Agency, either in terms of forecasting or evaluating future risk. And what might a major incident look like? Well, these are some examples of how big the biggest events we may have to worry about in terms of emergency planning look like. And if you think the 2007 flood, which is the biggest in recent history, certainly biggest this century, this last century, that saw 55,000 homes flooded. So we're looking at events potentially 5 to 6 times that scale inland. Surface water, we haven't seen since 2007 a major event over a big urban area. And we were lucky, in a sense, in 2007 that the storms didn't hit London, but moved into the Thames Valley. Because I think we'd have seen a much larger loss of life in central London if those storms had fallen. Because we're not used to it. We can't forecast it with a good lead time. And people will do some strange things in floods. The number of, I'm afraid to say this here now, but the number of middle-aged men who believe they can drive through floodwater in there is legendary. And the AA have a list of their top 10 locations where people seem to think they can drive through floodwater. And the number of times people do get stuck, is quite amazing. You'd have thought there'd be some local learning, but no, people will continue to try and do it. And it's all about your personal choice at the end of the day, your personal risk against the other things in life you've got to manage. And getting you to think about flood risk is really challenging. So for the emergency planners, this is important. Good early forecasting on the coast, tick. Generally good early forecasting for rivers inland, tick. Surface water, thunderstorms, we probably know with the Met Office there are going to be some. We'll probably know they're in the southeast, but we won't be able to say exactly where in the southeast and therefore what response individuals, emergency services should do. There just isn't that lead time at the moment. And of course, floods have a big economic impact, and these are some of the aspects related to two recent big floods. And the 2007 flood was the biggest flood in economic terms in the world in 2007. All those images you see from other places, 2007 topped it worldwide. The health impacts is interesting because the cost there is the health impact on the health service in terms of facilities. And actually there's a health impact on you and I from floods, and particularly from those people who've been directly flooded. Now, there's currently a study going on looking at a cohort from the 13-14 floods, which have been regularly checked in terms of their health. And overall, they suffer 20% more depression than the population as a whole, and 30% more anxiety. And that's going to be managed over time because those convert into real health costs across the country. And as was mentioned in the introduction by Sarah, the climate's changing, the weather's changing. And what we have to do is not just plan and build for today, but plan and build for the future. And on the right-hand side, you can see some of the allowances we make in terms of designing schemes for the future. So in the southwest of England, we will add on at least 20% to the peak flows we calculate for today to design a scheme for the future. We may add on more than that if there are particular circumstances at play. If it's going to be very deep flooding or very fast-flowing water, we may go to plus 40% to manage the risk. And we tend to take the central forecast, though, but that central forecast, there's 50% of the options could be higher than that, as well as 50% lower than that. Sea level rise, currently 4 millimetres a year in the southeast, but by 2086, it'll be 15 millimetres a year. So we're adding on about 1.2 metre for the next century, which is where we're looking for in terms of designing the life of a scheme. So we're adding 1.2 metres onto sea level for the future. Thankfully, storm surges and waves, there's probably only a 10% increase under the climate change models at the moment. So although the rainfall and sea level are going up, thankfully the waves and the storm surges aren't going up quite as much, but they're increasing. What the slide shows also is, on the left-hand side, the current situation is how many homes at risk of river and coast flooding are in different risk groups. The blue on the left-hand side is the very high risk. Now, at the moment, we're investing £700–800 million a year in flood risk management. And that's probably an optimum for the future in terms of the 2060s, the second set of columns, in terms of just holding the line and maybe just driving down the risk overall a bit. But we've got to invest that much just to hold on against climate change, development in the floodplain in the future, higher levels, densities of population in the floodplain. So we've got to think of other strategies other than just building schemes to manage flood risk. And I'll come on to natural flood management and what you and I can do a bit later on. Because I don't think it's a case of just putting all of our eggs in one basket in terms of building hard defences. That isn't the strategy for the future. I don't think that will be successful. Now, we've had recent floods, and I think this just goes to show that if you look at long-term records, we seem to have an awful lot of long-term records broken in the last 15 years. Whether it's seasonal, monthly, daily, they just keep coming along. And that may be just chance. But it may be something else. And I think those factors we mentioned earlier about climate change and what we're looking to in the future indicate where we think things are going. Now, 2007 I've mentioned once or twice, and I mentioned earlier the report by Viscount Waverley for the East Coast floods. His report was 37 pages long. And that's not 37 pages of A4, it's 37 pages of A5. 307 people died, all that trauma, 37 pages. That's all he needed. And after the 2007 floods, probably 15 people died, 55,000 homes flooded. We had a 480-page report from the government, Sir Michael Pitt. Now, things get bigger and better with time, don't they? This is actually a really good read. If you want to know about flood risk and all of the issues around it, and you've got time for 480 pages, get hold of a copy. It's well worth reading. And I think just a couple of comments from the 2007 report worth thinking about. Quote, to put the events into context, there were over 200 major floods worldwide. And this was the biggest one, as I mentioned earlier. It was also the biggest emergency response since the Second World War in England. 3,000 rescues of people from floodwater over June and July. Mainly because it happened so quickly in many locations, there wasn't evacuation, there wasn't warning. People were just caught. And of course, the challenge is to government, can't you do better? Well, maybe, but sometimes we can't do everything all the time for people. And we need to help people understand how they can manage their own risk within their home and locally. And community groups, flood wardens, have gradually grown over the last 15 years. And now we manage over 1,500 local flood wardens, volunteers who work with their local community on keeping awareness and helping people prepare for the future. December 13, 14, a whole range of storms coming in from the west, those westerly storms. We had about 12 what would be now named storms. They weren't named in 13, 14. Tidal surge, not only flooding, but also coastal erosion. This is North Norfolk, where you've got very sandy low cliffs, much like East Yorkshire. We probably had a decade's worth of erosion in one night, and a number of homes disappeared into the sea. In this location, Hemsby, it was a case of the local community were actually at the town hall raising money for their flood defences. Quite ironic. And they then came out to see this starting to happen. Boston in Lincolnshire, one area we knew was susceptible because the defences hadn't been improved for many years. Overtopped twice. In 2 locations, water flowed into the town. Interestingly, in Boston, very low take-up of insurance. Out of the 450 homes flooded, only 15 had insurance in terms of contents. Also, a large number of workers from Eastern Europe living, their view, house flooded, I'll go home for Christmas and come back in the new year. Just disappeared. So different things to manage. Southwest, we get a lot of people who like looking at our warning services to see where the big waves are and then go out to look at them. Now, that's great at one level, but what we don't want to see is people losing their lives watching waves and taking selfies. But 1314, this is a global map of sea level, wave height. The purple red are the highest waves in the world at that point. You can see where it is. So the southwest of England was receiving waves higher than anywhere else in the world over December, January. So I guess if you're a surfer, you do tend to head towards those points. But that led to the loss of many geological features around the southwest coast. Our defences took a real battering, and I'll come on to the repairs we had to do later. But a real pressure on the flood defences. But unlike 1953, where there were 1,200 breaches, kilometres of damage, although there was damage, most of the defences stood up to the battering they took, whether it was on the east coast or the south coast. Our ability to engineer and build is now good enough to resist those natural forces. But of course, some things fall down. And you'll remember the mainline railway at Dawlish? I mean, Brunel, when he was building it, didn't want to go on this route for this reason. You know, he said, this is not the right route to build on, but it was the only one he could get to build on. And he always said, we really need to find another route. So it's not as if this wasn't known or understood, but it's still there, and it's an infrastructure decision. How much do you invest protecting that or finding a totally new route for the South West Railway? And the South West was cut off, not only at Dawlish, but through the Somerset levels, where the rail line was cut. The River Thames, more water flowing through the Thames than any other flood that's been recorded back to the 1880s. Not the highest necessarily peak levels, but it just kept on raining and stayed at a high level for days and weeks. And that led to the sight of the government and the Environment Agency and local authorities trying to do their very best to create flood defences on the hoof for communities. We were using concrete blocks, road barriers to try and prevent floodwater spreading. We now use better temporary flood defences, and one of the learning points from 1314 was you can use temporary defences to protect people. In the past, we've tended to build big defences and give flood warnings and do evacuations, but not intervene to try and prevent flooding as it happens. We now do some of that intervention on the ground. Somerset Moors and Levels, politically, probably the most significant issue in 1314 winter. Interestingly, out of the 12,000 flooded, there were only 160 homes flooded in Somerset, yet you'd have thought the reverse from the political and media discussion around Somerset. And part of that was, I think, our own naivety as the Environment Agency in not recognising that for many people the floods come and go. So on the east coast they were flooded, but then the tide goes out and the water goes away. So recovery can start almost immediately. In Somerset they were flooded for 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 2 months. It just went on and on and on. And that built up politically a pressure. Why aren't you doing something to relieve this problem? And that became a real challenge for the government at the time to respond. Because I think most governments have learned that floods are not just an economic problem, but they're a social issue and they're a political issue. In the sense that one of the key aims of government is to protect the citizen. And if your home's flooded for 2 months, you don't feel very protected. Coming closer to home, 2015-16, Desmond, Frank and Eva, you remember them? Wonderful pop group, I thought. Particularly Desmond, you know, that storm originated in the West Indies. And it was, you know, you could see it tracking towards us. The question was, would it rain in Snowdonia or would it rain in Cumbria? And right up until the end, the forecasting models were uncertain of where exactly that rainfall would fall. As it was Cumbria, as we know. And that rain was record-breaking. Highest 1 day, highest 2 day UK records, highest amount of rainfall in December, back to 1910. And our river level gauges just, you know, they across the northwest and across into Yorkshire, they just recorded record levels. Some may be only 20 years old, but a number of them 70, 80 years old in terms of recording history. Just knock them out. And that's very unusual to see that intensity over such a wide area. Cumbria, we built many defences, such as at Carlisle, to withstand a very extreme event. So the chance of being flooded in Carlisle once we built our defences, we thought was 0.5% a year. We'd added on 0.5 metre for climate change over the next 60 years. The flood level we received was 0.5 metre higher than that 0.5 metre on top of the 0.5% chance of flooding. It just went right over the top. And I think the lesson we learnt is we didn't have a plan to cope with the flood at that level. We hadn't thought through what evacuations, what temporary defences, what approaches we might adopt. So for extreme event planning, that's a lesson we've learned for other locations, to have a fallback plan. Because basically, every defence we build, whether it's London or any other location, will at some stage be overtopped. You've just got to wait long enough. Because it's about risk management, not certainty of protection. So it's about sharing that understanding and deciding on what else we do. Lancashire and Yorkshire, Tadcaster Bridge, which reopened, I think, the end of last week. I mean, dramatic pictures when you see them on the television. Just reinforces the power of water. Top left-hand side in the Calder Valley, I was amazed nobody died in the Calder Valley. Steep catchment, rapid flowing water, deep, Boxing Day, you know, a recipe for something tragic happening. Thankfully not, and to a degree that may come back to the fact that the Calderdale Borough Council and ourselves have worked intensively with communities in terms of raising awareness of flood risk. Sirens, warnings, local community, flood wardens, etc. But still, quite remarkable, nobody died. There were 19,000 homes and properties flooded, but there were also 23,000 protected. So for some people in Carlisle, they didn't flood. Large parts did, but defences in some parts of Carlisle did hold. Likewise, you know, in Lancashire particularly, many areas kept dry because we'd invested in flood protection schemes. Some, though, overtopped. But once again, very few failed physically. Our ability to engineer and design is now strong enough to resist the forces of nature. We get it right, but they can be overtopped. So how do we manage flood risk now? You know, we've learnt from past events how to engineer solutions. We've got a good forecasting and warning service, particularly around the coast and for our larger rivers. We've talked to communities about flood risk where they're most vulnerable. But where we have real difficulty is talking to communities who haven't flooded. If we go along to a community who haven't flooded in the last 40 years and say, you're at the same risk as the people of Carlisle, it's very difficult to engage them and involve them in how they're going to manage their own flood risk. And there are things individuals can do and should do. One thing we need to do is broaden understanding of flood risk. And I don't know, any Archers fans? That's quite surprising, I don't know. Do you remember the flood stories that ran about 12, 18 months ago? You know, we worked with the producers to get that woven in, not just as a one-off event, but it ran on in terms of the impact it had on people longer term, economically within the village. I'm talking about as a real place. Oh, sorry, it is a real place, yeah. You know, you need to find ways of communicating risk in a way people will engage with. You know, if we just go along as a government body saying you're at risk, that's not always going to go down very well. You know, you've got to find different ways of working with different groups. And of course, you know, we've got to explain to people what the consequence of flooding is for them. You know, it may mean a rescue, which at the time may be exciting. But if you're then out of the home for 12 months, that's less exciting. I don't know whether you've got the image at the bottom, but in the middle is a chap swimming in his kitchen. I wouldn't recommend that. But, you know, might as well take the opportunity while it arises. But these are some individual views from people about what flooding means to them. And I think they're particularly poignant at times in terms of, you know, people realising what it means to them and their family and the dislocation and emotional impact it has. You know, people are overwhelmed. They feel helpless. They feel alone. They're left to deal with a lot of things without support. And, you know, if your house is flooded to any reasonable depth, it'll be broadly 10 to 12 months before you're back in it. Now, your insurance company may pay for another house. They may pay for a caravan in your garden. But if you moved away from your home, your children go to another school. They suffer. You suffer. So, you know, that personal impact is what we get involved in as much as the engineering side. We've got to be out there talking to communities just after they've flooded. We'd like to talk to them just before they flood, but invariably, most of the time, it's just after they've flooded. Now, thankfully, there's more than this as a solution to flood risk management. But it's amazing how many people, their first thought will be, I need sandbags. I mean, you could argue it's a bit of a placebo effect in the sense that I'm doing something, I'm putting sandbags up, but they really don't work very well. You know, it takes a lot of effort to build a proper sandbag wall which will actually keep you dry. And most households probably get 3 or 4 delivered by the local authority. And you try lifting a wet sandbag. What we can do is obviously understand flood risk, and I think we're world leading in terms of a lot of the computational modelling we do to understand flood risk, both in terms of the hydrology, our measurement of land, and our combination of those factors to create flood outlines. And this is Mytholmroyd in West Yorkshire, and the blue area, dark blue area, is what flooded 2015, Christmas, Boxing Day, and the light blue is what extent is what we showed on our flood maps, which you can access on our gov.uk website. You know, our modelling for extreme events is broadly accurate. You know, this wasn't a surprise in terms of, yeah, Mytholmroyd's at risk, your house is at risk. It will be this deep, it will be this fast. The Institution of Civil Engineers have produced their National Risk Needs Assessment, and we're spending that 800 million a year on defences, both building them and maintaining them. But that only sort of holds the line. It doesn't really dig into the risk in the future. And they point out that we're going to have to do more, that there will be large-scale disruption to services, economic losses, and public frustration. And we shouldn't underestimate that. But I think we're all agreed professionally that while we can build hard defences, we need to do some different things in terms of catchment management as well as individual action. So looking at what we can do across whole catchments in terms of reintroducing absorption into catchments, and there's been some great work on peatlands, in terms of more storage within catchments so the problem isn't passed on downstream. And I'll come on to some options for that in a moment. Insurance mentioned earlier, those Boston people, 4 out of 450. A lot of that was because, you know, certainly for building insurance, it was just too expensive. People just decided, why should I pay so much for my insurance and also have an excess of £25,000 before it even kicks in? What value of insurance is that to me? So Flood Re is a company set up by the government or mandating insurance companies to establish a reinsurance. So if you're not at risk of flooding, 2% of your household insurance is going into a fund to balance out the costs for those at flood risk. Now, if you've chosen to live in a dry place, you may resent that. But that's what we've got at the moment. But it's only a 25-year scheme. The aim is to move out of that within 25 years. Be interesting to see in 25 years whether or not that's been achieved. And I think one way of doing it is to get more personal engagement in flood risk. Why are people buying properties that are so high risk of flooding? We have a large capital programme, 2.3 billion over 6 years, a lot of money. I think we spend it wisely. The National Audit Office do. We do get £8 back for every £1 we invest in terms of benefits. It's a really good investment, flood risk management, in terms of payback. There are, though, an awful lot of organisations involved in flood risk management, and that may be an area we want to explore in questions. Natural flood management, it will contribute, it will give a real benefit, but will it stop major floods alone? Is natural flood management enough to manage major flood risk? And I think the view is, in most places, probably not. But around the coast, we've done some really large schemes which work with nature, which understand how nature manages coastal energy. So at Medmerry, we've set the defences back from the coastline. What that does is create wetland areas which absorb the energy of the sea, so that you're only dealing with the level, not the waves. The salt marshes are nature's way of absorbing energy from the sea. If we lose those, we lose that possibility. So we're engineering back natural processes around the coast. Sturt Marshes is another one in Somerset doing exactly the same. Natural management, but also hard engineering in a way. It's engineered back. I've mentioned about people. We want people to engage with their flood risk, know what it is, plan to cope with it, and then take action when the flood happens. If we can all do those three things, we'll be reducing the impact on our own lives and on society as a whole. But part of the equation is government needs to invest the things it needs to do, such as big schemes. Bottom one is in Somerset, Somerset Levels, where the house owner decided he'd build his own embankment around the house. Personal resilience, I guess, but of an extreme nature, and not possible in all locations. But top right, just raising your sofa off the floor so it's not damaged, straightforward, a lot of people could do that. Land use and growth. There's a big debate. Do people in this audience think we have a good control over development in the floodplain? No. Let's come back to that in questions then. Because I won't try to argue the positives of what we are doing at the moment. It's important to know we've got that forecasting from the Met Office, world leaders in terms of weather forecasting, but our weather is challenging. We won't get it right all the time, but we need that weather forecasting to convert into flood risk on the ground and then into warnings. Our warning system operates by sending direct messages to you as the public if you live in a flood risk area. You can either sign up for that, it's free, or if you don't sign up, we work with the telephone companies to get the numbers of phones within flood risk areas and send you a message to give you a warning, whether you've signed up or not. We're allowed to do that under the Civil Contingencies Act. We don't know who it is we're ringing up, but we think it's useful to give you a warning if you live in that location. We've got information services on gov.uk, which you can look at, which provide you with up-to-date information, allow you to look for your flood risk, and give you advice on what to do. We now, as I mentioned earlier, use temporary defences. We've recently spent 12.5 million buying aluminium framed temporary defences we can put up. Large volume pumps. Back in 2013-14, we had to bring them in from Holland. We've now got our own. This isn't us against the Dutch in terms of our pumps are bigger than yours, but it makes sense for us to have that capability and be able to move it around the country. And our incident response, all of the floods, I think, from about winter 2000, we've added on to our understanding and capability in terms of responding during incidents. That's not just us, it's the military, it's the fire service, it's the police, the local authorities, and we work as one unit. We train and exercise as one unit, then we respond as one unit. And I think you see a more visible response on the ground now than you probably did 10, 15 years ago, and more effective. I mentioned recovery early. You know, after these big events, particularly storm events around the coast, our defences take a battering. And after winter 13-14, those big waves around the southwest, coastal surge down the east coast, we had a £270 million bill to get defences back into the right and proper repair. So they didn't fail, but they took a bit of a battering. It's also recovery for communities. Communities need some way of looking forward, some way of rebuilding, getting back on your feet. And this is our chairman of the time, Chris Smith, getting some helpful advice from a local Somerset member of the public. And we've got to be there to listen to that when people are in shock, when they're angry, because we've got to work with them in the long term to help manage flood risk. And we can't provide defences which people want in every location. May not be the best answer, and we've got to choose the locations where the money goes furthest. But we've got to be out there listening and also hopefully engaging. So I hope I've given you a picture of what flood risk is about in terms of what we do, some of the events in recent years, and we will no doubt get more. This winter's been kind to us so far, and I hope it continues, but it's only a matter of time before the next big flood event. So I'm very happy to take some questions now and thoughts from you. Land use planning may be one, which you're interested in. You all seem to have the same view, so my fire exit's there. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to hand over to take some questions. Thank you. Oh, we'll go at the back, to the right, then we'll come into the middle section, and then you, sir. So, no.
Yes. One point about the phones contacting addresses. Technologically, it's probably possible to notify people who are in areas that are going to be flooded. Phone masts know where people are, so possibly it's technically sending out a message to people who are in danger areas rather than just static locations. The second point, I'm old enough to have observed the flooding in Western London in 1953 and still remember it. And I'm wondering how much talk there is between different department agencies. The Public Record Office used to be in Chancery Lane on high ground, and it now moved to Kew and rebranded itself as National Archives. And even though the towpath has been raised by 1.5 meters, most of the archives are well underground. Do agencies in the government talk to each other?
Thank you. I'll take the point from down here before I answer. Yeah.
I was just going to ask about the housing, because it's absolutely shocking, not just in London and in Oxford, where I'm from, about the amount of development on floodplains. And this is allowed to be going on, and thousands of houses projected to be built. I know that some of the ones in the Thames Estuary were only stopped because the Association of British Insurers said that they were not going to insure them, and so they'd become unsaleable. What role does the Environment Agency have in stopping some of these ridiculous developments?
Okay, thank you. I'll give some answers to those points, then come to the middle group. Phones, yes, the government have been looking at cell broadcasting, so being able to distribute from a mast to anyone with a phone on in that area. That hasn't been implemented yet, but should it be implemented, we would certainly use it. It's used in 1 or 2 countries, and it doesn't answer all the questions you might think it does answer, but it would certainly be a very valuable service. In terms of housing, our role is to provide that risk information. So where is at risk, to what level? So all of the maps we have are shared, and there's a portal on gov.uk for any developer, planning authority to get those maps. We also then provide advice to local authorities who make the planning decision on whether or not there are various problems or no problems on a particular application. So we probably comment on 7,500 applications a year. Last year, 2,500 of those we raised some objection to. That might be a minor objection. It may be about ecological issues rather than flood issues. On the flood issues side, most of the advice we give is used and taken up by local planning authorities. It's very few applications which go ahead against our advice. That doesn't mean development doesn't happen in the floodplain, but looking back over the last 5 years in terms of new development, totally new property in a floodplain, it probably runs at 200 homes a year. However, many people will see areas of past development being redeveloped in the floodplain. Now, if we were to take the view that you can't redevelop in the floodplain, London would eventually disappear. So the question is not, can you develop in the floodplain if you're already there, but how do you develop? So raising floor levels, so properties aren't actually flooded internally, ensuring there are evacuation routes so people can move out of the area and lives not being lost. So the advice tends to focus on how you can develop those areas which will be redeveloped. But that's, you know, some people take the view that is the wrong approach, but that's where we are at the moment. Let's take some questions in the middle. Sir.
Following on from that.
Do you want to wait for the microphone?
Okay. Oh, yes. Following on from that, if it's 200 houses a year on floodplains, they must all be being built in Chigwell on the Roding floodplain at the moment. What they've done there is they've raised the land up to build the houses on, but they're obviously providing a bottleneck to the Roding when it's in flood that will back up to Abridge, which is where most of the flood water is. And I've seen that in other places. They'll give permission if it looks as though where the footprint of the site is safe, but all the knock-on effects or everywhere else in the drainage system is not Redbridge's problem or Chigwell's problem, it's someone else's problem. Can you, with a much broader view, impact on that short-sightedness?
Okay, thank you. One behind you.
You talked about the possibility of retreating from areas that were under threat, and the Somerset levels were included. By chance, in the train on the way up here, I was reading that increasing those wetland areas increases the risk of malaria coming back into the country. Is that something that's been considered?
It's always good to have diverse questions.
You didn't mention anything about dredging rivers. There's been a lot of controversy about that.
Okay. I'll get a few, then we can.
On the Somerset levels, floods, you mentioned that the Environment Agency have now bought the pumps that the Dutch had. Yeah. I read on the internet at the time that the Environment Agency had more than one pump, but they were just in the wrong place and they couldn't be transported.
Okay, I'll take one more from this group and then I'll do an answer.
It's a brief story from the past in mid-Wales, where it also rains rather heavily, as it does in Cumbria. And a place I know well and have done for more than 50 years, in the 60s and early 70s, when it rained very, very hard for a long time, the local river, which is a tributary of the Severn, used to rise perhaps half a metre, at the most extreme a metre, over the next couple of days and gradually go down over a week. The Forestry Commission then came along and planted forestry in the catchment area. And when it rains heavily, the river goes up 4 or 5 metres in a matter of a couple of hours, causing enormous erosion of agricultural land and risk of flooding. And that carried on for several decades. Now the forestry has been felled and the upland is turning back into peat before they plant some more. It's back to how it used to be. Now this is a different aspect of planning, and it seems to me of control. And we are very, very foolish not to think in the broad term about how the water system works.
Thank you. Okay, just a few responses to those. I don't know the situation at Chigwell, although I used to work on the river roading, so I know the flood risk there and some of the work that's been done to reduce risk. But the advice we give to planning authorities is not only are you in a floodplain, but will what you're doing affect others? So we do advise on that basis. I'm not saying we've got it right in the situation you've indicated, and clearly you have a view that someone has forgotten something. But that's the sort of thing we do advise on, not just, are you building in a floodplain? The issue of, relocation that was mentioned, and moving away from areas. One of the pictures I showed was the Australian one. Now, I think it was that town, but I think 12 people died as a result of that flood. And the state government said, we're very happy to relocate you. We'll build your homes as they were, just in a better location. The majority of people, even though they'd got family members who died or neighbours, wanted to go back to the exact location that happened. They didn't want to move. Now, you'll all, faced with that question with yourselves, a lot of you would probably make that same decision for a whole host of reasons. But it's interesting, relocating development out of the floodplain and risk areas is not something we do. We may need to do it in the future, but we do lose bits of the East Coast and towns and homes disappear. But that's almost nature taking the decision rather than people. Malaria, I can't answer. So that's an easy one. Dredging in Somerset. Somerset levels, the local community wanted dredging. They felt that the Environment Agency and other government bodies were just anti-dredging. And the reason Somerset flooded was a lack of dredging. I spent 7 months working in Somerset, dredging the Tone and Parrot. So I know the local community there, I know you can dredge, and I know the pros and cons of dredging. I mentioned earlier that for every £1 we spend, we get £8 of benefit. In Somerset, the dredging of the Tone and Parrot that the community wanted was done. It cost £6 million. Now that £6 million will deliver about £8 million of benefit. So if you were being really hard economically about it, we could have spent that money better elsewhere and provided more people with flood protection. The government, though, decided that the people of Somerset levels deserved some investment for the future and made a special payment to get that work done. So that was additional special one-off payment. And the local community, as an agreement, were then given the challenge of saying, you'll need to maintain that, so you've got to raise the funding to maintain it. Interesting, shift. The pumps, we didn't have many high-volume pumps in 2013-14. We just didn't have any that big. We've now got a large number of pumps in a whole range of sizes, including, I think, 13, which are bigger than those pumps that the Dutch bought in. So our pumps are better than the Dutch. I don't want to brag about it. The 7 and forestry, and I think that's all about the natural flood management approach and catchment management. Interestingly, we're a part of DEFRA. The Forestry Authority are part of DEFRA. DEFRA are going to consult on a 25-year environment plan very shortly, within which this sort of dichotomy of economic development in rural areas through forestry and flood risk management will be part of the debate. Because it's not, oh, we'll just do natural flood management, it's all pluses. There'll be some consequences to that which will need handling. A couple more in the middle, then there were a couple over here, I think. Lady at the back, I thought there was one over here, lady there, yes, sorry. Oh, do you want to wait for a microphone? I'm told that I'll be able to hear you, but those listening to the filmed version won't.
A second barrier to supersede it?
We will need a second barrier at some stage, or a bigger barrier for London. At the moment, our assessment of climate change, how we can operate the barrier, means that we won't need a new barrier until the 2060s, 2070s. In the interim, though, we will have to raise some of the defences, those defences along the tide way, all the way out to Essex and to Kent. So we'll have to do some investment in that period, but not replace the barrier. But if we go back to 53 to 83, if we want it done in 2070, we'll probably need to make a decision in the 2040s. Because it will be a big investment. It'll probably be further downstream, potentially. But we're all right at the moment. That's the good news. Yes, sorry.
I remember the floods of 1953 extremely well. And as a responsible citizen, when the surge of 2013 happened, I tried very hard to find out what the risk to my own house was. I live not far from the Thames in West London. I share our colleagues' concern about the National Archive being below flood level. And Kew Gardens, but I'd also know that Barnes is an overflow area. But if I went onto the Environment Agency website and keyed in my postcode, would I get a straight answer about the flood risk to my house, given that considerable flood risk in certainly my part of London is burst water mains?
You will get a straight answer for river flooding, coastal flooding, and surface water flooding. You'll get no answer for burst mains, I'm afraid. But I appreciate that, you know, for some locations over the last 12 months, 2 or 3 in London, there have been very big water main bursts, which have flooded tens, hundreds of properties. But that's not something I can give you any solace on in terms of forecasting it or giving you an indication of when that will happen. But you will get a straight answer on location. So if you know the postcode of the archives, you can look at the risk today. But of course, you know, that risk is based on all of the flood defences working to the standards they're designed. But you'll get a very straight answer. I think we better go over here, because some people have been waiting very conscientiously.
Fascinating description of coastal defence. Thank you very much indeed. When you come to...
Please put it closer, we can't hear it.
Is it switched on? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right. Seeing Chris Smith on the screen reminds me about the Somerset Levels argument, to dredge or not to dredge. But the simple fact is that whether you dredge or not, you are exporting the problem downstream. Now, it occurs to me that Britain is about to leave the European Union and the common agricultural policy will have to be replaced. Do you anticipate any opportunity to build national level flood protection into a new agricultural policy which might encourage farmers to allow controlled flooding of their land?
Okay, thank you. There was one at the back.
Thank you. Within your slides, you were showing in particular that the surface water flooding aspects are probably the highest risk when you look at risk as overall hazard against consequence, in the sense of the number of properties affected and also the extent and inability to determine when it will occur and how quickly you can respond. However, on your flood risk maps, and those are not necessarily yours but produced by others with regard to surface water and in what you've described, the risk is assessed apparently, as far as I can see, on the risk of return period. In other words, how often that will occur rather than the risk to the people involved. And it strikes me that with regard to surface water flooding, the risk is considerably higher because of the inability to warn people quickly enough. Would you agree?
Thank you. I'll take one more from here and then, I don't know, Sarah, are we? Yeah.
Thank you for your lecture. Something a bit more practical. You talked about this aluminium structure. And if you don't mind, could you explain us how it works?
I can. I wish I'd brought some along so you could practice putting it up. Because it really is very easy. It's like a big boys Meccano set, the aluminium frame. You have a, I'll do this one first. You have a sort of support which is V-shaped, which rests on the ground. You then put an aluminium panel on top. You then put some plastic across the front, put some chains on to weigh it down, and then the weight of the water presses into the ground. And normally we'd only go up to about a metre high, metre and a half high, in terms of those types of barrier. But they work very efficiently. They go up very quickly. If you were trying to build a sandbag wall equivalent, you would be 10 times as long. You know, we get the military to do it, we get fire services to do it, we just deliver the kit, it gets put up to a predetermined plan. And, you know, I think we've learnt from places in Europe that that can be very effective. And we've used it over the last 12 months very effectively. And to move it around the country, we thought we'd like to do that, but then we decided actually that's something for a big logistics firm to do. So Stobarts distribute that across England for us. They store it in their warehouses, they distribute it, take it back. But that's that one. Surface water. I mean, out of that 3 million homes, many of them probably don't get very deep surface water flooding. You know, so in terms of risk to life, is probably quite low. In terms of damage to the property, it's the same as any other floodwater. You don't want it. You're left with a lot to clear up. But surface water does tend to go up and down fairly quickly. So, you know, for a lot of properties, they can dry out more quickly. So my worry with surface water is in areas where there are basements, underground facilities, whether it's the National Archives or the underground system, where you have people underground. And don't know whether many of you have seen film from Hurricane Sandy in New York, the tube line filling up with flood water, not surface water, but the impact's the same. You know, gallons rushing in, how do you get out? You know, Easter 1998, there was flooding in Leamington Spa, a lot of old Victorian villas with basements. We were very lucky then that people didn't die in their beds overnight. So it's about understanding the specific risk in the specific location. The issue about, you know, can the Common Agricultural Policy convert into something more flood-friendly? That's entirely possible. I think the way farmers manage their land in terms of, particularly the way they manage the soil, is probably critical to how much material gets into rivers. You can plough in a certain way to avoid material getting washed off into rivers, or you can plough in a way which allows it to move very quickly into rivers. Once that soil's in the river, it takes away the flood capacity. Now, you may be able to dig it out. The point about Somerset is actually dredging does work there and doesn't pass the problem downstream because it's right on the coast. Most of the Somerset levels are below sea level. You know, they're pumped drainage systems which have been there for centuries, and we maintain them as that. So the dredging works there. The trouble is, on the Severn, there's a very high tidal range, so every tide brings in silt, which then starts to clog up what you've just dredged out. So maintaining the Somerset levels, the Parrot and the Tone, you've got to go back frequently to do maintenance. So it's not just dredge it, come back in 10 years. You've got to go and do maintenance every 2 years. So it's a real challenge, and that's why the cost benefit isn't so great. I'm told that I think time's up. Is that right, Sarah? Or?
I think, unfortunately, it is. But I'm sure that if anybody has any more burning questions, they can come and find you.
I will be here for a few minutes, yes.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together. Thank you very much.
that actually global malaria has got that actually increasing would be a much greater increasing risk factor. I was just interested to know whether it was something that's a structural. I'd like to see that. Thank you. It is so, if there weren't enough already. He said something.